All right, so we're starting off the new chapter here dealing with cellular energy in section 1. And the main idea here is that every living thing that is composed of cells, which is all living things, require chemical energy. We know that living things require energy, but in this section we're going to talk about what is that energy source, how is it made, and how does it provide energy that our cells need. So for most cellular processes, the type of energy that we use, the type of chemical energy that we use is ATP. Now, ATP is a small packet of energy that we process and harvest from the energy that is stored in the bonds in the food that we eat. So when you eat that bowl of pasta and it breaks it down into individual monosaccharides like glucose, all those bonds that are holding the carbons and the hydrogens there contain energy. So when your cells break down that food molecule for energy, it converts the energy in the bonds of the food into energy stored as ATP. So when you look at like starch, which is what's in pasta, and you break that down into individual glucoses, right? Energy is literally stored between the carbon-hydrogen bonds in food molecules. So how do we get that energy? Well, ATP is the go-between that takes the energy from the food molecules and passes it off to cells so that they can perform the jobs that they have to do. So what is it about ATP that does that? Well, ATP is a molecule called adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine means adenine, which is a nucleotide, and ribose, which is a sugar, combined together. That's why they call it adenosine. And then triphosphate are 3 phosphate groups. And just like we saw with phospholipids, phosphate groups have negative charges. So when you take these 3 phosphate groups with negative charges and put them together and bond them together, they repel each other. They don't want to stay there. And since they are repelling each other, it creates super unstable bonds between those phosphate groups. And ATP itself is a very unstable molecule. And in chemistry, the more unstable you are, the more energy you have to release. So when ATP is used to fuel some cellular job, the way the energy is removed from this molecule is by breaking off this 3rd phosphate group. When you break this bond and remove that phosphate, energy gets released. And so when that phosphate group comes off and energy is released for some cellular work, it leaves us with a molecule called ADP, which is basically ATP minus that phosphate group. And so these two, it's a cycle. We call it the ATP-ADP cycle because ADP is similar to a battery that has run down, a rechargeable battery that has run down. When you end up with ADP after work's been done, you can recharge that molecule by adding a phosphate group back on. But that phosphate group is negatively charged, and so you're taking that negatively charged phosphate and trying to add it to 2 negatively charged phosphates, and it doesn't want to go. So in order to make an ATP molecule from ADP, you have to add energy, which we get from breaking down food, to put that phosphate on. So yes, you use this ATP to do work, but then you make the ATP from the food that you eat. And so we break down carbohydrates. That's our main, most commonly broken down food molecule, but proteins and lipids, they can all be broken down to make ATP. However, we can't store it. So it's not like if you eat, a king-size candy bar that you can take all that sugar, turn it into ATP, and then have this large, stockpile of ATP. ATP is far too unstable. It will just naturally break down on its own, and then that energy will be lost. So as ATP is made, it has to be used. We really can't store it. And you'll get about 36, and that's kind of a matter for debate, but anywhere really from 30 to 38 molecules of ATP from a single glucose molecule. So you can get quite a bit of energy. Now in terms of food, fats store the most energy. 80% of the energy in our body is stored in fat. And when you break down a triglyceride, when you burn fats, you get about 146 molecules of ATP from a single triglyceride. That's a lot of energy. But of course, because they are so large and complex, it takes a lot of energy to break them down too. It takes a lot of time and energy. Proteins also can be broken down, but they're the least likely to be broken down. They're just not high energy molecules. Amino acids aren't typically something that we need for energy production, but if they are broken down, they get about the same amount of energy from a protein as you do from a carb. So carbohydrates are the main source of energy, getting about 4 calories per milligram, lipids 9, and then proteins back to 4. Now, in terms of ATP and chemical energy and food, um, so where does this energy come from? You have some organisms, we as heterotrophs get our food from other sources, but we rely on autotrophs to make that food for us to consume. There are other types of autotrophs out there that don't do photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, we know, requires sunlight and carbon dioxide, and it makes sugar. But there are other things that do chemosynthesis, and they use other types of molecules. They use chemical energy and other types of inorganic compounds to produce carbon-based molecules. The process is similar to photosynthesis, but instead of solar energy, it uses chemical energy. And a very good example of that would be the autotrophic bacteria that live around the ocean vents at the bottom of the ocean where it's hot and those nasty gases come out of the cracks and the fissures in the Earth's crust. You have big colonies of bacteria that live there, and they are autotrophs, clearly not using sunlight, but they use energy, chemical energy and heat energy to produce their food.